What's up, everyone? On today's episode, I have an interview with Scott Spaulding. It's a really great episode. Scott's a veteran of the terror wars who is now a peace activist and a libertarian. So we have a lot of interesting things to talk about, including his time in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's in those countries and important points in the war. So we talk about not only his experience, but we tie it into the current events and explain why the wars need to end. It was a really great interview. I'm sure I'm going to have him back on the show again in the future. But before we get to that interview, I just want to take a minute to talk about the sponsor of the show, Paloma Verde. Paloma Verde is a company run by Carlos and his wife, Vanessa. Carlos and me are somebody, I talked to him a lot. He's a great guy. He's really fought throughout this coronavirus to get this company, Paloma Verde, off the ground. So if you go to palomaverdestore.com, could get some information on his CBD products there, and CBD could help you with various things, taking the edge off physical pain. So think about it, try it. When you get your products at CBD, they're lab tested, so they're high quality, and they also tell you how CBD could help you, how you could take it. They're different products. They have gummies, soft gels, extracts, all kinds of stuff. So think about giving them your business. palomaverdestore.com. Use the promo code peace, PEACE, at checkout. You get 25% off, and it lets them know that you're getting their products through the show, and that helps the show. Carlos is somebody who believes in the mission that we have here, and the causes that we're trying to promote and what we're trying to inform people on. And so, support him because he's a great guy and really believes in peace. And let's get into the interview. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. I got a really awesome guest on today's show. It's Scott Spaulding. He's at MDVet4, the number 4, on Twitter, or the actual name MDVet4Peace. And as the Twitter handle suggests, he's somebody who served and then is now against the wars that he served in. So maybe we could just start there, because this is always just so interesting to me. People who I'm sure have an emotional attachment to, the mission and everything, now being against the war, and you fit in that category. So how do you end up in the war and then turning against it?
Well, I kind of grew up in a militarist town in Annapolis, and military family, or at least not no one. I never was a military brat, but everybody in my family had been in Vietnam, World War II, World War I, respectively. So I had this sort of history where that was kind of going to be it was the only thing I was ever going to do. I think maybe there were signs earlier that maybe it wasn't exactly perfectly suited for me. I'm a little bit more empathetic and things like that, um, but I ended up, joining the Marine Corps out of high school as a reservist, and then being part of it, kind of happening into this job called civil affairs, which is basically trying to, when you see the hearts and minds parts, where the ones that are supposed to be maximizing civilian support and minimizing civilian interference. So and I end up in Iraq for my first deployment, and then my second. And it's around the time of 2007, 2008 that I see the wars aren't really working. I'd always been kind of raised in a conservative, constitutional sort of family. And I started seeing some things about how, really I like to think of it sometimes and we're the redcoats there. You know what I mean? And I started seeing that, but I also started seeing myself as being more and more adept at doing my job of mitigating those redcoat things. The whole job of civil affairs is kind of consider whatever the rest of the military is doing will affect the civilian population. So if they decide to kick in doors and occupy everyone's houses, we're supposed to be the voice saying, do you have to kick in every door? Do you need what about this thing like probable cause? Like maybe we just don't do every house, but we focus on something, or thinking about maybe you don't kick in the Sheikh's door, or this kind of stuff would be our place. So I kind of saw myself for a while being the um, voice of reason and trying to fight the uphill battle to make sure that we did this right. And I thought we could win it if maybe we respected it somehow. I didn't really see exactly how. And then I gave in to sunk costs for a while. I kind of lost faith in actually achieving anything, but was like, um, and then finally, kind of it all came together. Um, After a few years after my last deployment, I started really, really diving into libertarianism. And it all came together when I realized that everything that the military does is like it's a giant test bed for all the worst government programs. You know what I mean? Whether it's prohibition or drug prohibition, taxation. What was it, Madison, who says that, standing armies are the fathers of all the other evils in government. You know,
Mm.
something I'm paraphrasing, but I sort of finally that light bulb moment clicked, and then in retrospect, I saw, and that's all these different moments along the way in my life where that gave me doubt that I saw the military doing things wrong, or really that what we were doing was counterproductive. And it all just kind of came together around 2014. I got out of the Marine Corps, I went to grad school, and I kind of moved on with my life. And then about a year ago, for a while, I just, screamed into the echo chamber. Actually, I didn't even get on Twitter or Facebook or anything, but I just screamed in the echo chamber by myself. But about a year ago, I learned about the Defend the Guard Act, and I moved into trying to be an activist. And that's been like the last year is actually being really vocally anti-war and trying to be ecumenical, open to everyone from all sides, because I think we need everyone we can on the same side. But that's a 5-minute synopsis, I think.
Right. I'm just curious if the like libertarianism came first, because like I see on Twitter, you got like the Jacob Hornberger thing up there, so you're obviously like pretty into the libertarian thing, or if you turned against the wars first, and then like that was like, oh, the state's bad.
Um, it was they kind of fed back on each other. So I was sort of a conservatarian, let's say, and then when I started hearing libertarian arguments, not conservative arguments against war, I was like, there's actually that's like I started I never would have said I was like fully libertarian for a while, but when I started hearing I became libertarian they happened together. It
Okay.
was like as I learned more about being libertarian, every piece of information I had about how the military and the war was functioned, how the wars were progressing, made sense. It kind of had a great explanatory power about why we've been there so long and what the incentives are that are screwed up. So they complemented each other and kind of all came together for me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for you, having experienced that, you could see how the state was failing.
Mm-hmm.
Where, from my perspective, where I was, I was young, like preteen during nine
Mm-hmm.
11. So when the wars are starting, like I was for the wars, but I was 13. And
Yeah.
then after like I went to college, I started to become a libertarian, but the wars were the last things that like I really changed my mind on, because
Yeah.
there's just so much propaganda that like it's going well, it's not going so well, but it's getting better. It's not getting better, but it's gonna get better. We're about to turn the corner. And so there was always like, we're almost there. And so
Mm-hmm.
it just not being in it and not seeing how ugly it was, that was like the last thing that had changed my mind, because you can't go to Afghanistan. Like, you could see what the drug war is doing, even if you don't live in a community that's like impacted by it on a daily basis, like the inner cities are. Like, you drive through the interstate. I can't drive through Afghanistan. I can't drive through, that's just not something that's gonna happen.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't like see the impact. And so I'm guessing that it probably had a lot to do with, you think, why it was so easy for you to change your mind on the war issue. Because a lot of libertarians I talked to, and I remember like when I was a libertarian in the Ron Paul movement, everybody was like, yeah, I like Ron Paul, but I don't know about his foreign policy. Like, that was like the part that they had hangups with.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't question it entirely. I was open to it, but it was the hardest one to explain. How could this work? How could it be? How could we be any other way than we are? And really, the big challenge even now, and it's hard to ask people to make the leap of faith that we don't need to be there. Like it's like I mean, we've been in a it's I mean, it's not it's a I might break this analogy, but we've been in a fight with somebody for 20 years now, exchanging blows. We finally realize that this is counterproductive theoretically, and people are afraid to stop fighting because what if when you walk away, you get punched in the back of the head? You know what I mean? And it's not unreasonable. And so it really trying to create this picture of what it would look like if we stopped these wars is I can understand why people are concerned about it and why it is a hard one to come around to. But and it will be a leap of faith, and there will be, and if we ever do end some of these wars and anything goes wrong afterwards, there will be recriminations over it, which is really unfortunate. But it would definitely be blamed on, and you can't live in the two worlds where we did one. We can't have a counterfactual where if we keep going in the wars, that something even worse happens. But I think it's more likely than not that the longer we go these on, the longer we, and honestly, the more we screw over allies, leave people out to dry, um, we just ruined our name in there, and it's got to end. I think we're just only setting ourselves up for something far worse
Yeah.
the longer it drags on.
So, just the whole stab you in the back as you're trying to leave analogy, that seems to be what a lot of people are worried about, especially when it comes to Afghanistan. I feel
Hmm.
like for whatever reason, I don't hear that argument as much with Iraq, but Afghanistan, it's always if we leave. Well, first of all, you have people like Tammy Duckworth suggesting that somehow like the troops are going to die on their way home. And I was reading an article in Responsible Statecraft this morning by Gil Barndollar, and he points out in there like from what we've seen from the Taliban, they'll do just about everything but drive you to the airport to get you out of their country. And that that's kind of why I imagine like if you really needed to, they would probably help you pack up or blow up whatever you need to blow up on your way out the door. Not
Well,
really, but um,
well, there is a phenomena that's referred to when the British tried to pull out of Yemen. Actually, in the '60s, they had a colonial holding there, and it was not working out. And when they tried to pull out of Yemen, their last little vestige was Aden, the port where the USS Cole was bombed. And and as they tried to pull out of there, everyone, I mean, the city kind of descended on them and attacked them. And they called it Aidan Syndrome. And I learned about this actually when I was like a lower level minion doing basically the grunt work of setting up for these coin academies. I was part of the traveling road show with Kilcullen and whatnot. I was like one of the token civil affairs people. And I would travel to some of these things, and we were teaching the security force assistance teams before they deployed. And one of the things we studied and warned them about was this Aiden syndrome, where you've got to watch out for basically blue on green. That what honestly, what probably is the greatest risk is the corrupt government and the military that we've created have to kind of cleanse themselves of the sin of collaborating. And the best way to do that could be to turn against the military that's abandoning them. You know what I mean? So, and turncoat. And that's a thing that there are historical examples of having cause for concern, but that's not a reason to stick around. When you have a wolf by the ears, you don't just hold on to it forever. You've got to figure a way out of it,
right. So
you
you're
know?
saying that it would be like the Afghan government you would almost have to keep your eye on. And I mean, I guess that would make sense. There are warlords, like absolutely brutal, insane people like Dostum now in the
Yeah.
government there. And so I guess that's not something that like I would think about, but that is something. But I was more referring to like the Taliban being the concern on the way out. But
Yeah,
that's a great point.
and that's reasonable. It's reasonable too, but I don't know if you came across it. It kind of went semi-viral. The New York Times Daily had a little story about the Afghans and a guy who's been covering an Afghan journalist who's been covering the war, and the negotiations in Doha. And he went to Afghanistan relatively recently to talk to Talibs on the ground. And he didn't note this comparison, but it was very obvious to me. He kind of noted the difference between the graybeards that are negotiating in Qatar, who are willing to negotiate and see this as all part of a political game, and then the actual ground level fighters in Afghanistan who are somewhat more radicalized to a certain extent. They weren't even alive during Taliban rule. You know what I mean? Most of the fighters. But at the same time he expressed they're exhausted, and they wanted to know from the journalist what the Taliban leadership was, when they could expect to stop fighting, because they were exhausted. But the Taliban leadership kind of views them as pawns and is using them to escalate, keep up the fighting, keep up the pressure up to the last minute when they can finally declare a peace. And to me, it was so obvious that that's exactly what the generals are doing. They're using these numbers of troops in Afghanistan. It's not. I mean, if you look at any poll of veterans of the wars or active duty troops, whether they want to continue going to Afghanistan, the answer is a resounding no. But people are exhausted. They're tired of it. But the generals don't care about that. They want to extract themselves in such a way that they can get garner the best possible outcome for themselves, really, is what and that's the only reason this is dragging on both sides. And that wasn't covered directly in the daily, but the parallel was just so obvious to me of what,
Right. So I guess I'm guessing you support a U.S. withdrawal, and I'm curious of you on your bio you have yourself listed as being in the Helmand province of Afghanistan in 2012, which would put you there right about like the peak of Obama's surge, right? The maximum number of U.S. and NATO forces in the
uh,
country.
Yeah, so my first deployment was not immediately after Obama got elected. It was 2009, and that was to southern Helmand, uh, to right just outside of the district capital, Lashkar, just to the south. I could see Lashkar from our fob, but it was outside of our area. So I was there for that, sort of the initial beginning of the surge, and I was at the tail end of it on the way out in 2012 in Sangin, when we started shutting down the bases to the north of us one by one and consolidating and handing them over to the ANA. So I kind of was there at the beginning and end of that, and I was honest to God scared. It was ended up oddly being my least dangerous deployment, just because there's fighting seasons there, and I wasn't there in the fighting season. Um, but my last trip to Sangin, I was the most terrified, because not only had one guy from our unit been triple amputated in the 7 months prior, so the guy was replacing lost two arms and a leg, but I mean there were IEDs everywhere there, and I was just sure that I was going to lose a leg. Um, and knock on wood, I never got shot at. We found some IEDs, but yeah, I was there on the front and the back end of it when we really had all this hope that if we just, grab, clear, hold, build, we'll make it work. And then on the back end, where we're just like closing bases down one by one and pulling back into larger bases. And then just after I got home, a Vice documentary that I think everyone should watch, called "This Is What Winning Looks Like" came out, and it was right on the fobs that I had been at. I recognized some of the ANA soldiers, and seeing it all, whatever was left behind, just going completely to pot, as we, yeah, just a few months after I left, that was filmed, and then I watch it a year later or so, and it was just, well, that's exactly what our winning looks like. It's not going to happen.
Well,
You know.
and the crazy thing is that was 7 years ago, right? Because we're now in
Yes,
2020.
it
So
really is.
I don't know. When I think about these wars, I feel old now. Like realize because like 2012 feels like a couple months ago to me. Now that I'm 30, and and so yeah, like it's a
It's
long
truly
time.
absurd when you look at these things. I mean, I just I just went back before Veterans Day and revisited this book that I bought years ago called Operation Homecoming, and that's really that in itself. And it was a book that was a collection of stories, poems, cartoons created by veterans while they were overseas. And it was interesting. It was founded by it was actually one of the cooler things the National Endowment for the Arts did, and it wasn't entirely propagandistic. There were parts like that, but they sent Vietnam veterans turns writers like Tobias Wolff and I'm blanking on the one from The Things They Carry, Tim O'Brien. They sent them to Iraq and Afghanistan to do writing clinics, and then collected all the writings, compiled the best of them into a book, and then they made a documentary, a sort of, they made some of them into little mini vignette films. And that was in 2006, 7, they made that. And this is people talking at the beginning of the war. I mean, there's essays from like, I can't wait to start the fight. We're flying in, we're expecting to go tomorrow. And this is 18 years ago now. These people are in their 40s. Um, you know, and it's true. And one of the really tragic things is to think about, there were, so many of these situations, but there was some, sort of hearts and mindsy section of the book where they talked about, well, we helped this little girl, we gave her eye surgery kind of stuff. And this is in 2003. That girl's maybe 25, 30 years old. She's still living in a war zone all this time later. It's great you did that, but like, what else? Like, how much longer do these people have to live under the continuous threat of violence? Not only, I mean, a lot of the violence is internecine, but a lot of but we are definitely an element, a contributing factor. And it's really absurd to think about that. And at the same time, like something like only 50 of our Congress people, like less than, I did the math, it was 12% of Congress was in office when the military force was authorized. Only 12%. The rest of Congress and the Senate that are sitting now, they voted on continuing resolutions and funding bills, but they've never been asked to directly vote on this. Like, that's how long this generation, and we think of Congress being like homesteading and being in their seats for 30 years, and that's true. But that's literally how long this war has gone on, is that only 12% of Congress was in office to vote for it.
Right. And one of those was Barbara Lee, who voted against it. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
just to add into it.
A certain proportion of them did vote against it. Like, actually, to give some credit to the Democratic Party, among the Democrats that rose to the Senate from the House, none voted for the war except, Biden was already a senator. So some sitting Democrats in the House voted for the war and rose to become senators, but none who voted for the wars rose to become senators.
Just the war in Iraq, because I think the war in
Yeah.
Afghanistan, the only no vote was Barbara Lee.
Correct. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other, like, kind of, I think is a huge news story on Afghanistan that's not getting any attention here in the U.S. But in Australia, they came out with this war crimes report. And so just sounding, from your role in the military, you probably would have heard civilians or did you get complaints or
that was I dealt with that every Thursday.
Okay.
We had claims days on Thursdays. That was literally one of my roles, was dealing with civilian casualties, carrying around a backpack with $50,000 in it, and paying off. And if we killed your husband, here's $2,500. That's the standard fee. If we shot your lock off, here's $10 to buy a new lock. If your cow got caught in the crossfire during a gunfight, and 3 people all say that it was their cow, I've got to figure out how to split the baby in half, and how much each of them gets. As you mentioned that, and as I was listening, I don't know if it was your show or somebody else speaking to a journalist in Australia about that incident. We've had incidents similar. There was the one fellow that went off base in the middle of the night and killed a bunch of Afghans, and he was brought to justice. We also have tons of incidents, obviously, that are kind of in a gray area, shooting a civilian because just because we perceive them as a threat incorrectly, erroneously, which never gets really investigated unless it's really egregious, unless it was premeditated murder. You get the benefit of the doubt at every step along the way. As long it's sort of like with the police, if you can articulate that you felt a threat, then you won't be in trouble.
Right.
And
I
it actually
imagine that
reminds.
if a cop could get away with shooting Tamir Rice on the side of the road in the U.S., you get away with shooting
I'm
pretty much
I
any Afghan male, at least.
I mean, honest to God, that I paid. This is one of those ones. I just use as an example. There were millions. There probably in the country there were millions more examples, if not hundreds of thousands, um, where a guy just pulls up too close to a convoy. Doesn't break, slams his brakes hard, but too late, and the Marine puts a round into the driver's head. You know,
Hmm.
Guy's dead. Now what do we do? And there's some situations that gets dealt with, but some convoys that were on the road all the time. I remember catching a ride in Iraq with a shot the driver, and then I don't know if anybody hung back. I didn't know anything about it. We just kept moving down the road. Who knows if that was dealt with?
Hmm.
You know what I mean? And if anything was ever done to address that. And I actually I not completely forgotten about this interlude, but myself, there was a young Marine on my team on my last deployment who at the end he was a troubled kid. He eventually got himself kicked out of the Marine Corps, but but he confided to me the day after we got home to Afghanistan, mm, in veiled terms, that he may have shot this person that he distrusted, that was an Afghan who kept coming, making what he considered to be fake claims or robbing us of all that money we had to give out. And he very, very strongly implied that he murdered this person while he was up on post one night by himself. And he saw the guy walking away from the base and he murdered him. Is is the He said, yeah, he said something along the lines of, I was sitting on post one night and in the evening, and I saw this guy, and I just you know I had to get rid of him. Something along, kind of veiled terms. And I reported it to NCIS that night. And this was literally the night, maybe the night or the night after we get home from Afghanistan. He's drunk, he's making this confession to me. It could have been the words of drunk, and he was an idiot. I mean, this guy was a real mess. He could have been just saying stupid things, but basically I spent an hour being interrogated by NCIS, and so did he. They concluded that there was no evidence, because how could there be? This is something that I couldn't pinpoint a date on, couldn't find any other, I didn't have any other details. Maybe I should have kept him talking while he was drinking instead of just shutting him down and dragging him back to his room. But they just concluded, well, there's no evidence. We can't conclude anything, so we're going to move on about our lives.
Hmm.
Um, it became a factor for him when he was being court-martialed to be kicked out for something else, and I had to be deposed for that. But it still was never actually um, taken seriously as a and that and how that's just the things that surrounded me.
Right.
There were a couple million people that deployed that probably saw or heard things like that. You know.
So the payments, condolence payments or blood money, however
Yep.
people describe it.
Hmm.
I'm just how did let's say somebody legitimately lost husband, son, whatever,
Hmm.
killed by a US soldier. How do they react to receiving the $2,500?
Um, I wish I had the perfect adjective to describe it, but it's not a happy moment for them.
Hmm.
Ruthfully, maybe, reluctantly, but you know, it is a great deal of money in their economy, to be fair. But at the same time, it is a pittance by American standards, um, to pay for a wrong, by all accounts, what certain things were by all accounts a wrongful death, a grievous mistake, or yeah, at best, and
Hmm.
still that's just it's what do? It's what else can you do? You know, you can. technically not supposed to apologize. God knows what the interpreters are actually, what words the interpreter, they don't get the lessons on, well, legally we can't apologize because that could be construed as claiming guilt. We're just expressing our solace. The payments are called actually solatia payments. We're in solace with you is
Mm-hmm.
all we're willing to express. Um, um, those are, you just kind of do what you can. Um, the more challenging ones are the kind of, especially um, people who live near the bases we create, who are constantly caught in crossfire or have helicopters buzzing over their fields and just destroying their crops and kind of continual daily indignities and destructions of their livelihood, who kind of like some of them get incredibly frustrated and some of them are just like, well, let's see how much we can grift the Americans for. That was
Mm-hmm.
definitely a thing. Whenever, it's one of the things as a civil affair, as a Marine with a backpack full of money, you learn over time is to be kind of cynical, unfortunately, especially in their first month or so there, because and there will be people who try to scam the system um, as it exists, but at the same time, I don't know. In retrospect, now it's like of all the money wasted in Iraq or Afghanistan, of the 6 trillion plus interest that we've wasted away, the SERP program, the Solatia payments program, is a minor chunk, and I wish now that I had just been a little bit more honestly, if the taxpayer dollars are going to go anywhere, then to somebody who at least I know has probably had because there's also so many other daily indignities. I mean, the Constitution does not apply, and the principle, and that's what, being stopped and searched just because a Marine takes the unkind look at you and says, you know what, this guy's got to be searched. Um, all of those daily indignities of being in a war zone, in an occupied country, like, add up, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying justify violence, but I can understand, being raised as a person who revered the patriots who fought for independence, and being able to see them on some level as people who have just had their rights constantly violated, and are reacting the way people do when their rights are violated, is something that I tried to express to Marines from time to time, and it never really took, with anyone I really worked with, but. I really think I really wanted my sort of magnum opus before leaving the Marine Corps to be like, to get, and it's maybe not too late to publish something of like, the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights as a counterinsurgency document. Like, basically, if you follow these rules, you won't create any more insurgents. This is literally just a list of things that got people to go um, from peaceful farmers to shooting at you. You know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, yeah.
So I mean, just one of the things in all that I'm thinking of too is like, if you're some guy and the Americans keep flying helicopters over your house, and every time it does, it like, scares your cattle or destroys a little bit of crops, as you say, or scares your children. There's been some studies done on like places where they have drones hovering overhead all the time,
Yep.
and it creates a lot of PTSD in children. And so,
Mhm.
I mean, if you could go get $2,500 from the people doing that to your kid, like, I, I can't get mad at that,
Yeah.
and like you talk about just all the little like kind of suffering that people had to go through because of the occupation. But
Mm.
maybe before I definitely want to switch over to Iraq, because you
Yeah.
spent some time there, and I guess
Mm.
this was actually earlier in the
Mm.
timeline for you, like 2004, right?
Yep.
You're in Iraq, so what maybe because I do want to get to like what's going in Iran and how
Yep.
that all ties
Mm.
in too, but they are talking about drawing down some more troops in Iraq. I'm
Mm.
guessing that you're supportive of getting out of that conflict after being there and everything.
Absolutely. I mean, that was an even, more absurd war to ever get ourselves involved in the first place, and our lingering presence there is just. I mean, they were not welcomed by the government we created. in this case. They've asked us to leave more than once now, and we just refuse. And now we're here. Um, Possibly somebody dropped a bomb on another Iranian general in Iraq this morning. Unknown. Um, I think we need to get out of there. Um, it's long past due. I don't see the advantage whatsoever in holding on to Al-Assad. I think is the only base we're still really clinging to. That and the green zone. The oh, sorry. One
That's all
second.
right.
So yeah, we need to get it's long past due to get out of there. I don't see any tangible benefit except our ability to continue trying regime change in Syria, which it's really just a launching point for what we're doing for our action in Syria, which I think, frankly, if we don't get out now, then there's a real risk that it's going to ramp up in the near future. And I mean, we've seen signals from Biden's potential appointees that they want to amp up the pressure and continue trying to change the regime in Syria. So that's a huge problem. I was for a long time trying to make sense of Trump's somewhat difficult to follow actions as far as why is he veto the Yemen withdrawal, but all this. And I had a thought that was somewhat disconcerting. That one thing that might make sense for why he's no dove and he is pushing for war with Iran pretty clearly, is that it's potential the troops in Iraq in particular are a liability in a war with Iran. They would be surrounded by an extremely unfriendly population. They wouldn't be useful logistically because it would be, it would be impossible to run supplies. The roads in Iraq don't even run from Saudi Arabia to Iran. Troops, especially, they would just be a liability. And I was thinking and partially concerned that his rapid withdrawal attempt honestly might have been an attempt to get the vulnerable pieces off the chessboard before he started something with Iran.
So
Our occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq don't actually help us in a war with Iran. They would get in the way. They would be a hindrance and a vulnerability.
right.
And I was afraid that getting them out would actually be opening the door to him starting something else.
So I thought that too. But then my thinking is there's so many other U.S. military assets in the region. I mean, they just deployed B-52s. They're sending the USS Nimitz, the aircraft carrier, back. We have, the Fifth Fleet stationed in Bahrain, a base in Kuwait,
Just
and
giant bullseyes.
Qatar, right? So, I mean, you've been to the region. You may have a better idea of this. Would all those still be liabilities, or do you think there's a particular liability about U.S. troops potentially in Iraq and then Afghanistan, where the Hazaras are friendly and Shia and part of the Afghan National Army? So, are those like particular like threats, you think?
I don't think there would be as much of a local threat in Afghanistan, but I don't necessarily believe that it's like supporting the logistics train to Bagram Air Force Base is incredibly long. It costs something like $400 per gallon of fuel to get fuel there, um, to operate from, and it's pretty remote to from there to conduct operations in Iran. You'd still have to get through Farah province and Herat. It's a long way without very good logistical assets. So, like, what is it bringing to the table? They might not be threatened, but they might be within ballistic missile range, is what I would think. And also not really bringing anything to the table. With the troops in Iraq, I think they would be surrounded by out west in Al-Assad, they wouldn't be. It's a Sunni area, so they wouldn't necessarily be surrounded by a hostile population, but it wouldn't be a good situation. And I don't think the southern Iraqi population would be supportive of us moving troops and supplies for a war with Iran through Iraq in that way. And we might see a lot of trouble logistically moving just with IEDs and other hindrances to supplying the war through there. So I just don't see them being assets. Whereas the bases in Qatar, and we have, you know, dictatorships or, let's say, friendly governments that would protect our bases there, and we wouldn't have to worry about the local population interfering. But so I would say that might be the difference between having all those assets there, and even, I mean, having the carrier in the Gulf. That's one. I'm no expert on naval combat. I'm not, but it's my vague understanding that carrier in the Gulf would be really, really in a grave danger, and they would actually have to get it out of the Gulf and into the what is it, the Bay of, the on
Arabian
the other side,
Sea,
yeah,
or the
on
Gulf
the
of
other,
Aden is right
yeah,
there.
yeah, basically on the other side of the Strait of Hormuz. They'd have to get it out into that area to operate from, because it would be in real danger. There was a famous situation where a Marine general was a war game, and he was posing as the Iranians. I don't know if you're familiar with the story.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you are, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, and he basically just knocked the snot out of the Navy using the playing as the Iranians by, suicide boats hitting carriers and stuff like that, basically. And it became pretty obvious. At least my understanding is that our Navy would be better off outside that region, which is another whole thing that I'm not quite expert enough to speak on, but that's my general understanding.
Right. So, you mentioned the assassination, or the airstrike that report to have killed. I guess there's no at least when I read, there wasn't confirmation. It
Mhm.
was some kind of Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps general who was around the border of Iran or Iraq and Syria. In the past, we know Israel has targeted like complete Hezbollah in their region. So my guess is that whichever plane did, it had a star on it. Whether it was 1 or 50, I don't know. But
Yeah.
we had this airstrike carried out there. So I think you probably understand the dynamics a lot better than most people of when we're attacking the Iranians or Shia, that are backed by Iran or Shia forces, that's not going over well with like the Iraqi government and everything else. So, I mean, is there potential for like the kind of green on blue attacks that we have seen in Afghanistan? Or, I mean, do you think it's like putting troops more at risk because now we're going to see more rocket attacks? Or, how do you think this plays out for, like, if you were in Iraq, Iraq, how
Yeah.
would you feel about this airstrike being carried out? Would you think it like put you in more danger or more safety?
Well, I mean, we saw what happened the last time, where they managed to, as I understand it, very precisely land a bunch of dud missiles, for lack of a better term, exactly where they wanted to send a message at al-Assad. Now, so I would feel like if I was in one of those places, I would be not only at risk of Iran reacting more vigorously the second time around to a second pretty severe provocation, but also, as I understand it, a great number of the people of Iraq are very supportive of the role that the Revolutionary Guard Corps played in helping rid them of ISIS, or at least they appreciated that Soleimani was kind of the leader of again in the war against ISIS. But here we are blowing up people who are fighting against ISIS, to a certain extent. Um, so as I imagine, just as a Iraqi who's not even would be upset and not really understand why that's happening, and as a military member um, who's in Iraq, I would be very concerned about, yes, what we saw last time with some rocket attacks against the green zone and whatnot. I would expect it could be expected in the future, some kind of play out like that. The difference being, I think the Iranians are frankly smarter and more patient than our government, and they might just wait it out. They might be willing to wait this one out until new administration comes into play.
Right. This is maybe the one advantage to having Joe Biden labeled as president-elect right now, is that
Yeah.
at least there is some reason for the Iranian government to calculate that things may get better on January 20th. The
Mm.
other thing that happened, of course, is the assassination of, I guess, the one of the founders of the Iranian nuclear program. I did want to mention on today's show that on the last show I had called him a civilian, which I don't think is really accurate because he was a member of the IRGC and I believe had the rank of brigadier general. Although this is like a scientist and an academic, he wasn't. Iran is certified to have not had a nuclear program, a nuclear weapons program, in at least 17 years. And on the last show, I had compared him to somebody who works at Boeing or something like that, and I think that's pretty accurate. The Iranians just have their military industrial complex all more tied into the government than the U.S., where we have companies that are private who make weapons and sell them to the government. And so I didn't want to say that, but all these things I think are just really concerning in wrapping up conflict here. And I mean, as somebody who served in Iraq and knowing what could happen, what are your thoughts on what the Biden administration should do towards Iran when he takes office to try to settle things down there?
Oh, well, one has to first hope that he would actually get advisors in place who would encourage him to settle things down, which doesn't look like that's in the making. Um, but because I mean, every president takes guidance, but I think Joe Biden will take a great deal of guidance from the outside, from the people he's surrounded himself with, um, to ramp things down. I mean, I think definitely. It's hard to know if the Iranians will trust a new agreement. They would have a reason to believe that they should get a stronger guarantee in the next whatever the new JCPOA is, and they might not have any incentive to negotiate. But I think it would not be wise to keep ramping up tensions. But I think until the I don't I often joke about my father, who's a boomer, who seems obsessed with Iran as this specter of evil on the planet ever since 1979. And I was looking just recently. I saw the generational breakdown of Congress, and it's still 2/3 baby boomers. And there's something that happened to them that maybe I can't understand from being from a different generation, that they all seem to universally regard Iran as this threat that it doesn't appear to be to me. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? They are a regional power, and not much of. I mean, they were fought to a standstill against Saddam Hussein while we were backing him. You know what I mean? They, um, they're not this massive threat that we make them out to be. And I mean, nuclear proliferation is always a concern to me. I really would love to denuclearize, um, but I don't see them being how for how many years are they going to be 5 years away from having a bomb? You know what I mean?
Right.
It's been what, about 20 years now that Netanyahu's been running around saying they'll have a bomb next year. Like, how many times can you cry? Can Chicken Little cry? You
Right.
know, before we just kind of accept that we're only giving them more reason to build a bomb. Every time we ramp up pressure, every time we threaten war, we're only giving them more reason to ignore the peaceful elements and enable the hawkish elements
Yeah.
that exist in their country.
I mean, maybe part of it's, they don't think about it too hard, and 2005 always feels like 5 years ago. And so they're always about to make their bomb.
Yeah.
And, you talk about the age thing in Congress. I mean, I think that's huge. Look at Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell. They've been there forever. Nancy Pelosi could barely stand up straight or speak. Biden can't even walk his own dog. Like, we have leaders who are frail, old, and in this, like, long set mindset where Iran's the enemy. And I guess back in 1979, long before I was born, they took some American hostages, but since, the Americans have downed a plane full of Iranians, so
and
let's
and a
call it a
million
wash.
and a million other things too.
Right.
I just I, there has to be more to the story that I'm missing. It feels like, you know what I mean? What has Iran done that Saudi Arabia hasn't done to its people in spades? You know what I
Right.
mean? We talk about them being this theocratic dictatorship, and they're easily more democratic than our allies in the region.
Hmm.
Like nothing. There's something that doesn't add up, and it's not even. I'm not even convinced it's Israel because Israel was willing to sell them weapons during the Iran-Iraq War. You know what I mean? They weren't Israel and Iran were not always enemies even after 1979.
Right.
You know, so what am I missing here? And I don't know what it is. I swear it's just they're scarred by the Carter administration, maybe thinking about cutting one carrier from the fleet, and no one can fathom that. You
Yeah.
know?
All right. Well, I mean, like all this stuff that you've been part of is really interesting. But I know you read up a little bit on what's going on in Tigray. This is the northern region of Ethiopia where, I guess for about a month now, there's been fighting in the country. Uh, I'm not exactly sure what all the dynamics are. The Ethiopian government, and there is some, I believe, Amnesty International and others have like said that on November 9th there was a massive massacre of I don't know people of what ethnic group, but by the people of the Tigray ethnic group. Although it
Mm.
does seem like the Tigray ethnic group has been the target of some ethnic targeting by the actual government in Ethiopia. The president there had called a couple times for them to lay down arms, but this was at the barrel of a gun. And now I believe they've marched the Ethiopian army all the way to the Tigray capital, and
Mm.
the Tigray Liberation Army, I forget exactly what the initials are there, say that they're going to a more guerrilla style of fighting. So what's all going on with this? And I know that the movement of the Ethiopian troops is pretty important.
Well, that was a great synopsis of most of the things that are going on. It seems like they had a coalition government that involved the Tigray before, which sort of has fallen apart, and it's really destabilized a lot of things because apparently um, there's a bunch of Eritrean refugees who had escaped to Ethiopia from the dictatorship there, who are now in Tigray and also under threat. They formed a major part of their military, and their military power was the Tigray contribution was important, and Ethiopia has been acting as a military power in the region. They they were responsible for invading Somalia at the around the time that the Islamic Courts Union was forming a government after the decade of anarchy in Somalia, and sort of sending them back into the civil war that's happening there. And that was primary. They're the primary contributor to UNISOM, the action in Ethiopia, or
In
in Somalia.
Somalia, yeah.
Yeah. So it's really just real mess there is the best way you can describe it. There's refugees from every group in every other part. There's obviously a great deal of food instability happening at the moment, and it'll probably affect our withdrawal from Somalia because it's probably going to pull out some of the Ethiopian power in Somalia at the same time we're trying to pull out of there as well. So it's difficult to know how that's all going to shake out, but I wonder how how these administrations will handle it, whether they're going to take it as an indication to be more interventionist in East Africa. Obviously, Djibouti, I believe, borders right there, and that's where a major part of our that's a theater in our action. It's actually where we launch a lot of our actions against Yemen from. His camp is there as well, is nearby. So I would be surprised if we are not going to, under something like a Biden administration, take a much greater role or try to get ourselves involved in what would be uh, probably quite a quagmire. Because as far as I understand it, they've always been very unstable developing countries.
Well,
There.
from what we've seen from his administration, they're the people who look at Rwanda, and every single situation on planet Earth is Rwanda. And what the U.S. could do is we could fly our little drones overhead and make sure that a whole bunch of people never go out machetes again and slaughter innocent people. And
Mm.
that's what they believe in. They thought they could fix Libya that way. It's largely that same team. It's Michelle Flournoy who's going to be the Secretary of Defense unless by some miracle that could be prevented. Tony Anthony Blinken, who again is a humanitarian interventionist. So far, I haven't heard of Sam Power having a position in the administration, but I'm sure she's on the list and stuff like that. These are the people they're going to fill their cabinet with. And yeah, I mean, Ethiopia is a concern. I mean, Mike Pence, or not Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo put it on the radar this week saying he's concerned about what's happening there. They're expecting another 200,000 refugees in Sudan, who they got refugees fleeing that country to Uganda, and all kinds of other crazy stuff. And not to mention, the country in Africa I really have my eye on for the Biden administration. I keep calling him Obama. Biden administration is Nigeria. I think whenever there were some protests there about a month ago, it was right before the election. There were a lot of liberal chat marks I saw on Twitter taking notice and pointing that out. So, let's hope we're not all over Africa flying drones over the skies of everywhere.
And wasn't it the 100 that we just managed to shut down the $100 million drone base we built in? Was it Nigeria? Nigeria. I'm sorry.
I believe it was Nigeria.
Nigeria. Yeah. So yeah, that's not. Sorry, but yeah, that's where they would probably be launching the drones from. And the Nigerian, we happened to train some Nigerian soldiers once at the civil affairs school. Interestingly enough, they got civil affairs training. But yeah, they obviously it's a very difficult regime there. They were protesting, police violence essentially, and corruption in the police force was their biggest element of protest there. But how many years can we? It's another place where we have to be training them forever and being this sort of neo-colonial, we'll teach you how to police your own presence all around the globe. And it's unfortunate, but the answer will probably be yes, even in spite of all the evidence that it never has worked.
Yep. All right. Well, on that very sad note, we should probably wrap because we're heading on an hour here. But I definitely love to have you back on the show again. I know you're like starting up some projects and everything, but tell people other than going to @MDVet4, the number 4, and searching that on Twitter, how can people find you and everything you're doing?
The most most interesting project. I'm starting up this project. It's not going to be a libertarian project. It's going to be, I'm calling it Why I Am Anti-War. It's going to be politically agnostic. It's going to be a short podcast, 5 minutes, hopefully 5 to 10 minutes, of a different guest every week sharing an emotional experience they had, whether it was something they witnessed or maybe a piece of art they saw or a poem they read or a scene in MASH, whatever it might be, that made them question war. And kind of trying to hit people on that emotional note, because we have a lot of great shows like yours that cover the current events and we can give all the reasons and rationalize why to end wars. But I think the piece that might be missing is shareability, because this is 45 minutes is too big of an ask for a lot of people when you want to share something, and the emotional hit for why you should actually, how this affects people. So that's going to be @Anti-War Podcast. On Twitter and Instagram, antiwarpodcast.com. I'm building the website right now, and that's kind of, look forward to that in the next before the new year. I should have some episodes out.
All right. Well, once you get it back up and running and everything, shoot me a message and we'll try to do another show. That way we could put it out there in front of people why you got it up and running and everything. But I really look forward to it. It sounds great, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Take care.